or so, and be able to take questions. And then we'll also go into breakout rooms. And I also have some questions within the talk itself. So basically the idea here, I think everybody can see this. Yeah, so the general idea of today's talks is what would a Biden administration look like when it comes to US-China relations? That's kind of the big question. And what's really interesting here is that people have really, the general consensus is it won't really change that much. They don't see that much of a change in warmer relations. The Democrats actually traditionally have been harder on China than the Republicans, particularly since the 1990s into the 2000s. And so the Trump administration's view and take on China is actually quite different than any Republican administration we've seen in the past. So to see a Democratic administration will be any warmer than what we've seen recently may be different, may not be that much different. What will really be different here is probably the tools and the way that these trade war or relations are conducted, how they're conducted, and maybe more surgical than kind of what we would say larger blunt instrument. We had a great talk the other day by Professor Jack Zhang, who's in the Department of Political Science, and he also kind of gave that a much more nuanced and clear idea about how this, the need for a more surgical kind of way of looking at and approaching this. And it gets at basically what I've always argued, that is Chinese-US-China relations something that is a bedrock that has relatively stable and calm, and that politics are like the waves on top of the ocean? Or are those relations at its core unstable and change dramatically between administrations? And that's kind of the big question that we're kind of looking at. And the Biden administration actually may test that as well. The Trump administration certainly has tested it. And will that continue? So there's three topics I'll look at. Because there's such a wide range of topics, I just narrowed in on three. The trade war, and I'm going to focus more on deficits and US jobs, which has been the big talk about whether or not that will change under Biden administration. Climate change, and going into the Paris Agreement, and collaborations. And I'll narrow in a little bit on medical and education. And there are many topics that will not be addressed in this short period of time, including human rights and how that will be addressed in the US-China relations, probably more front and center than it has been in previous administration. Taiwan, which is an extremely important topic and a very sticky issue for every American president, and it will get no less complicated for the Biden administration. South China Sea, Chinese military expansion, the One Belt, One Road. These are all very important issues that the Biden administration will have to address, and will most likely address it differently than the Trump administration. However, given our time, I've kind of narrowed in just on these three specific topics. So the US trade war, one of the biggest issues in the US trade war was the balance of trade, that the balance of trade was seen to be way off. And when the Trump administration came in 2016, the balance of trade was lower than it was the year before. But the idea was to reduce that trade deficit. And what we see here, and this is data from the US Census, it's on US foreign trade. You can get this data easily available through the website. And this PPT is available to students afterwards if you'd like. And that these numbers pretty much clearly suggest that we haven't seen a real huge difference in that trade balance. And that trade balance was kind of one of the key factors that kind of started the trade war. And most economists would suggest that a trade imbalance does not necessarily mean an unfair imbalance. It really means that one country may be relying more on services and another more on manufactured goods. Most countries, developed countries, kind of move away from manufacturing and towards services, and that is kind of outsourced. So there is this kind of natural change and a balance. But again, the United States has traditionally taken on higher deficits, particularly with China, since the beginning of the Chinese economic reforms. So to address this is a real issue, should be addressed, but how we go about it is really the big question. Another thing I will not go into too much depth is intellectual property rights and how US companies are treated in China. and that varies. But I thought Professor Jack Zhang also did a good job with this. The China Town Hall meeting did a good discussion of this. But most common economists would suggest that this idea of all companies being treated the same and having the same experience in China is not the case. Some American companies succeed very well, and some have a harder time. Usually scale. Larger companies do well in China. Smaller ones have a harder time. So U.S. dependence on Chinese rare earth. The trade war has really hit a unique vulnerability that has not really gained that much attention. But what is rare earth elements, a wide range of consumer products such as iPhones, electric car motors, military jet engines. The United States is actually reliant on China and several sectors for these rare earth materials. So China supplies about 80% of rare earths imported to the United States from up to and into the trade war. China is home to at least 85% of the world's capacity for processing rare earth ores and materials for manufacturing use. Now, this could be used as a very significant type of trading balance. We haven't seen China restrict or say they're going to embargo these rare earth metals to the United States during this war. No major kind of threats have we seen through the trade war. And hopefully we won't see that in the future. But that is something that needs to be taken into account when we think about the trade war. It isn't just the trade imbalance, but it's also the type of goods that we're looking at and that are being traded. One of the biggest issues that we've seen is the issue of American job loss. That's probably one of the driving forces behind the current trade war and the idea of bringing manufacturing back to the United States. And that is probably going to be historically the measure of success of whether or not that has succeeded. The main person that is one of the top advisors for China advisors, is a guy named Peter Navarro. And Peter Navarro wrote a book called Death by China and a documentary that went with that. And he was at UC Irvine before joining the Trump administration. And he is pretty much one of the driving forces, not the, but one of the driving forces behind this trade war and this idea of that, this will bring jobs back, that this is one of the key factors that they want to see happen. And one of the big questions is, how successful was it and how will this continue? And think about under a Biden administration, because really this has been US labor and labor unions have been very concerned about this with good reason for many years. And that's been more of a Democratic administration push. So what started under Republican Trump administration, would that continue or even be exacerbated under a Biden administration, or will they change tactic? So here we kind of point the finger at China for American job loss, particularly and a steep decline in manufacturing jobs since China entered the WTO. And so US manufacturing jobs are lost to technology, not trade. So one of the big issues here is how much has been really lost to trade and how much has been lost to high tech, and that is robotics and automation. The US did indeed lose, almost 5.6 million manufacturing jobs between 2000, 2010. But according to the study by economists, they said that 85% of these jobs are actually accountable to technology change. And what kind of evidence do we look at that would suggest this? Because this would actually be a very important part of the trade kind of war discussion and where do we put our focus. Actually, even Fox News got in on this and said it's not Mexico or China that's taking our jobs, it's robots. And so when we get, I always try to look at different news sources and to see when they jive or don't jive. And when you see CNN and Fox kind of come up with the same idea and the same concept, that kind of helps push that idea a little bit further, at least and popular. So you take a look at something like this, and we see this looking at the real manufacturing output and employment. So what would something like this tell us? Well, US manufacturing output has not been in a steep decline. If anything, it's been in a increase, particularly after 2000, right? And then we see a dip in 2000, in 2008, and still continuing. But how could we have an increase in output and a decrease in manufacturing employment? So that's that contradiction there. And that increase in output and decrease in employment suggests that it is mostly manufacturing jobs that are going down a little bit. Here it says manufacturing production versus employment, percent change since the end of the most recent recession. If you just take a look from 2010 to 2016, and this is from the Federal Reserve statistics, that manufacturing output is increasing at a much higher rate than manufacturing jobs. So one of the key explanations here is that automation, that this manufacturing output is more of a result of automation and robotics than it is from actual people being involved in. Now, manufacturing jobs have still increased, but in different areas of manufacturing, particularly high tech. So, but it is harder to point a finger at a robot, right? It's easier to say it's China than it is a robot. To say China's taking our jobs seems like a little bit more that we can do something about it. When you say a robot's taking my job, what can you do about it, right? It requires a tremendous amount of domestic retooling and a tremendous amount of investment and a very clear policy agenda that can address this. But to point at China sees, okay, now we have a trade war, we will deal with it. But to point the finger at a robot makes it much harder to deal with. And it doesn't mean jobs weren't lost through manufacturing. There were, but it seems the majority of them, by most accounts, is this automation. So now, where do we put the energy and the policies in, and particularly a Biden administration, given this understanding, how will the Biden administration treat this, and whether or not the trade war has actually been successful in increasing U.S. manufacturing? As we know, companies that have left China have mostly been smaller companies. Larger companies, Johnson and Johnson, these are large conglomerations, even huge American car sales, Buick. I mean, they are staying in China and doing well. But the smaller ones are having a harder time, and they're not moving to the United States. They're going to Vietnam or Latin America, countries in Latin America. They're not coming back to the U.S. Our tariffs against China bringing factory jobs back to the U.S. About 41% of companies are considering moving factories from China because of the trade war, or already have done so, but fewer than 6% are heading back to the United States. And leaving China, once you've invested heavily, is also a very, very difficult decision. It isn't just, you have a trade war and you lose a little bit and then you come back. My own discussions with people who have investments in Chinese factories and investments in Chinese industries, American and European, they tell me you ride it out for as long as you can, because the initial sunken costs in moving to China and moving operations to China is so large, and the relationships you build over time, you don't want to lose that over what might be a short-term trade war. So how long this progresses may change that calculation. But for many companies, moving is not that easy. It isn't a decision taken lightly. Disentangling the effect of the tariffs on globally connected U.S. manufacturing sector. This is two very well-known kind of economists who are on the Federal Reserve Board. This is a nonpartisan government agency that was looking at this. And what they find is that U.S. manufacturing industries are more exposed to tariff increases, experience relative reductions in employment, as positive effect of import protection is offset by larger negative effects of rising import costs and retaliatory tariffs. Higher tariffs are also associated with relative increases in producer prices. So what they're saying is, in short, is that much of our imports are becoming that we need. Our exports are cheaper, but our imports are becoming more expensive. And this is hard on many companies. And companies are actually laying off people because of this. Also, relative prices are going up. And that is particularly for goods like bicycles, sewing machines, washing machines. We see our furniture prices. A lot of these prices, computer prices, have been going up. And that basically puts the burden on the consumer rather than the other country. So will the trade war continue under Biden? That is the big question, and why would we think it would or it wouldn't? Will American manufacturing return to the U.S. under Biden? Could Biden, what would his administration do or could do? Or is there nothing that they really could do to make that change? That is inevitable, and it's going to need a different tact or different approach to investment in order to deal with that loss of manufacturing. And what are the costs and benefits of the trade war? I mean, some of the benefits have been putting things on the table like intellectual property rights and protecting certain industries that needed it at the time. But again, was the cost of this trade war worth doing that? Climate change and the Paris Agreement. This is a quote taken straight from the United Nations, the Paris Agreement. And what is it basically means is it's a global temperature rise, trying to get the global temperature to decrease. And it takes a community effort and an international effort. The US did not attend or abide by this agreement. And so one of the things that a new Biden administration said that they will do almost immediately is to be a part of the Paris Agreement. This is from November 9th. And this is Joe Biden's climate plan could put Paris targets within striking distance. So, and this can be done through executive orders. And this is something that will need help with the Senate and the House of Representatives, but there are things that the president can do directly in order to improve this. And this is where foreign relations in the United States may change dramatically, particularly when it comes to dealing with climate change and how that affects the US relationship with China. Will that make that relationship closer, more collaborative, or will it create a climate change competition? China is a leading contributor to climate change. It is also one of the leading nations combating climate change. When I teach my courses on China, one of the most important things is the contradiction, right? This is a complete contradiction, but it is very much the situation that we are at hand and what situation the Biden administration will be facing when talking about climate change in China. So on the one hand, you have to try to get China to reduce emissions. On the other hand, you need to collaborate with China on some very important, large renewable energy projects and ideas that could help collaborate in a global sense to bringing down the temperature. China on track to lead in renewable sources as the US retreats. Now, this is something that we've seen in news sources just up to the last few weeks, right? And so even though this is dated 2018, it's pretty much up to date. China is the world's biggest emitters of greenhouse, but there's still investments in coal in recent years. China's relies on 80%, not 80, sorry about that, about 59% of China's energy relies on coal. It just 10 years ago, even less than 10 years ago, it was about 70%. So China is reducing that, but it's still much dramatically higher than the US. And so, but China is still leading in renewables and kind of taking the lead once the United States stepped away from the Paris agreements. So what would this do to China's lead as climate change once the US steps back in? So China, the US, China was leading and at the table, then China steps back. China starts to move in as a leader. And now with the Biden administration, the US will try to move in as a leader. Is that going to crowd out or is it going to be more collaborative? That's the big question. The US secedes leadership on climate, but China sets up. This is exactly what I was talking about. So, is this, are we going to work together as two leaders or will there be a competition about who will be the leader in climate change? Will America's reentry, improve US-China relations in this area? Why or why not? The optimist, right, in me sees that this would be a great opportunity, both for China and the US and the planet, right, if they can collaborate. However, it's cautious optimism because issues like the trade war or issues with the South China Sea, these could be, not peripheral. They could have an influence in this type of collaborative work. So again, this is where are we headed? The US and China and the US-China CDC have had some very important medical collaborative work. Ever since China opened, I mean, it goes back historically to during the Republican period in the 1930s, U.S. investments and philanthropy in Chinese hospitals and medical. And then we see that kind of end in the 1950s and 60s and during the Cultural Revolution. But once China starts opening up, we see a renewal and a big type of collaboration with the US and China. And the US CDC and the Chinese CDC have collaborated on some very important issues, including the flu shots. If you ever got a flu shot, right, the flu shot is part of that collaboration. A really important article from the British Medical Journal on Public Health came out. It was just the timing of it was pretty remarkable. It came out in 2019, and this is 10-year U.S.-China laboratory collaboration, improving response to influenza threats in China and the world, 2004 to 2014. So from 2004, the National China Influenza Center and the United States Center for Disease Control have had cooperative agreements. This includes, right, our flu shots. But what it really means is that there was always this kind of institutional relationship to help get and build this. Now, the trade war and that U.S. tensions happening just at the time of COVID, and then COVID could have been an opportunity, depending on the leadership, to come together, to actually build on this institutional relationship to help find a vaccine and deal with similar ways of dealing with it, both policy-wise and vaccine-wise. However, many medical professionals and public policymakers say that was a missed opportunity. And it just continued to say, and blaming China on this rather than going forward. Not that there wasn't some blame to be put there, but getting beyond the blame and moving towards collaboration didn't happen. It's possible it still can. Could a Biden administration pick up from this and build on this current relationship that has been so beneficial for the US and China before the trade war and before COVID? So will medical collaboration continue under Biden? And why would we see this and why not? Right, so these are kind of the big questions that are out there as well. Finally, education. Right, so China sent nearly 370,000 students to the United States in 2018-2019 academic year, accounting for 1/3 of all the overseas students in America. That is amazing, right? That number has more than quadrupled over the last few years. And when I first went to the university in the 1990s, there were very few Chinese students. And the only Chinese students you saw were mostly graduate students who had scholarships. Mostly East Asian students were coming from South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. And so since the entry in the WTO, and especially that lag of from about 2001 to increasing incomes and a rising middle class, after 2010, we saw a dramatic increase, and it's only been increasing every year. And so Chinese students contribute to almost $15 billion to the US economy every year. And this is about 1/3, again, of the figure for all international students, according to the US Department of Commerce. So if you're interested in this, the Institute for International Education, the IIE, is a really good source to look at this, and it's very easy to look up and get that information, and the US Department of Commerce. And this really hits right here at KU. I mean, look at these numbers. This is from the international students. This is from our International Affairs department here, International Affairs unit here at KU, a university unit. And the director is Charlie Bankert, Dr. Charlie Bankert, who's a fantastic director and a fantastic leader in this area for KU. And they put together an annual report. This is the most recent annual report. And we look at it here, and where are the most of international students coming from? China, right? So the vast majority, I mean, not just the majority, I mean, the most of them, right, are coming from China. That wasn't the case when I first came to KU in 2003. It was actually, you had India was pretty high, and in East Asia, mostly Japan and South Korea. But now China has outstripped all of those, just right here in our own community. And the Chinese international students have contributed much to our community beyond the tuition. It's the engagement in classes, being involved in the community, being in the Chinese New Year celebrations, the Chinese going to and learning about KU and being involved. So it is more than just a tuition benefit for KU. It has been a cross-cultural benefit as well. And KU students have been going to China in greater numbers, and even with more scholarships coming from KU as well. So will student exchanges continue under Biden? Will that, we've seen in recent years, and just in the last couple of years, an attempt to reduce that number, an attempt to be more strict on visas, particularly J visas. So is that going to change? And is that something we might expect? And that's something that hits right here at home, I mean, us directly. And so that's my, I know I packed in a lot there for 20 minutes, but I tried to narrow it down to specific issues that we can, relate to, and then try to decide where we think that might go within a Biden administration and a change. Are there any general questions? I think there's some here in the chat. Okay, I'm not sure. You're talking questions. Okay, so I have one question here in the chat. It's a long one, so let me read it here for a second.
I wasn't sure how to word it to keep it short, so my apologies.
Oh, okay, right. So that's very good. So Olivia brings up this really great question about what is buying domestic, right? When you have Nissan or Toyota that invest in an American, that invest in America, build a factory. They may have Japanese managers, but they're all American workers. And then you buy a car from that manufacturer. Is that a domestic, right? That's a great question, Olivia. I think my impression is, given what we know, it would be domestic in that sense. But even cars out of Detroit are not fully domestic because of the supply chain and parts. So I guess domestic would have to be not just where the company is based, but where it's built and how many parts were actually built in that country. And I think we tend to find that tends to be very hard to find something that's 100% made, well, particularly cars or high-tech items where you have supply chains that are going from all over the globe, which has been the hardest hit are companies like this, the trade war, because China has been such an important component of this international supply chain. Excellent question. And so is there any indication that Asian companies and plants in the US plan to move because of the trade war, that is leaving the US and going back to Japan or somewhere? And what we've seen has been, that's a great point. I don't have an answer for you right now. I don't know that off the top of my head, but what I do know is that some Chinese investments in the US have been stalled or stopped, which kind of gets a little bit at your question about that. So that is one thing I do kind of have read about. So excellent question, Olivia, which is not a surprise. So.
Great. So we're going to go in breakout rooms now, and I've written down the questions and put them in chat that Professor Kennedy asked during his presentation. So I'll go ahead and put them in there and open the breakout rooms. So thank you.
And what do I do at this point?
You can join a room, or you could just go ahead and.
I'll bounce between the two rooms.
Okay, you're a co-host, so you should be able to do that, I think, fine.
I think my students will know that they notice I do breakout rooms too, and I do a lot of bouncing, so they'll recognize. Okay. And how was that? Was that okay?
That was awesome. Thank you so much. No, that was wonderful. Okay, so
I just hit breakout room, and I should be able to see join. Now there's two rooms, right?
Right.
Okay, let me see here.
Oh, it looks like a lot of people left from the breakout room too. So maybe I should move people into breakout room too.
It says I've been assigned. So I've been assigned to one.
You've been assigned to breakout room too, but I could move you if you don't.
How about if I just join breakout room 2 for a minute and then go to breakout room 1?
Okay, and we can, yeah, that sounds good.
Okay?
Yep, sounds great.
So then I'll just come back to this one and ask you to put me in the next one.
Okay,
that work?
sounds good. Yeah.
Okay.